I love Danganronpa. As an anime channel starting out, I just had to say that, because unlike every other anime channel, I haven't demonstrated my love for the franchise yet by filling my videos with its entire soundtrack. Truly, I'm also not alone in my love for the franchise, as many developing weebs in the West will note Danganronpa to be one of the first, if not the only, visual novel they have ever played, since the game's unique art style, theatrical presentation, and edge so sharp that it could cut an idol causes it to stand out compared to other members of the visual novel genre. Coming out in 2012, it served to catch the younger generation of weebs who are now artists, video creators, and cosplayers of today. The cast of characters are still popular cosplays, and the merchandise for the game is still being sold, even 10 years after its initial release. This fame that the franchise has amassed is not coincidental. These are durable games, and its influence in the anime community can almost be described as historic. It's only because I hold the franchise in such high regards that I can confidently say that DanganronpaV3 was disappointing. Not to say that it's a bad game, it's just not a good game. It rests in this weird spot for me where I wouldn't recommend it to anybody who hasn't liked the first or second game, but wouldn't recommend it to anybody who hasn't played Danganronpa before, which would be kinda weird to recommend somebody the third installment in a series anyway. Let's just say I have issues with the game, and its failures to live up to the standards of the previous titles. Its shortcomings are still baffling to me, as the game didn't lack an understanding of what made the previous games good, but rather how much of these elements should be in the games. So for new weebs out there that haven't heard about the franchise, welcome! Please don't click away, I don't get many views. You might be wondering, what is Danganronpa? Danganronpa is 2 parts Ace Attorney, 1 part WarioWare, and 1 part your favorite eroge. What makes Danganronpa so special isn't a single element. It doesn't follow a straight path set out by industry standards for the genre, with slight variations in its gameplay or story to make it interesting. Instead, it creates this very unique experience, wrapped up in a beautiful 2.5-dimensional bundle. Danganronpa games only function similarly to each other, with each game building on top of the previous one. This includes the plot, which is generally shared from game to game. Your character, along with 15 other students, find themselves trapped in an isolated location. There is no escape from this location other than to murder the other students and get away without being found guilty. Your character, of course, doesn't kill others, and instead decides to solve these issues as they arise. The game is run by the extremely merchandisable Monokuma, who's essentially Danganronpa's Jigsaw. The story of the games themselves are dark, with a lot of deception, betrayal, and, well, murder. With all those dark elements, you would expect this to be a depressing game, and it is. But the game doesn't completely let a few dead kids dampen its spirits, as the presentation of the game is actually more corny and tacky to make up for the darker tones and lighten the story altogether. Take the executions, for example. When a classmate is found guilty, they aren't just taken out back and never seen again. Instead, they're subjected to a public execution, with an ironic twist. These executions are over the top and wild, with even some of the darker ones having elaborate sequences and explosive action and animation to accompany what would otherwise be a depressing moment. The gameplay for these games consists of shuffling through dialogue, exploration on a 3D plane, managing your time to interact with classmates, solving the mysteries as they arise, and completing puzzle-based mini-games. All these elements help make Danganronpa the game that it is, and not one of them can be separated from this game without the entire project suffering for it. The 2.5-dimensional environments give the game its special art style and charm. Solving mysteries brings an element of sleuthing to its story and encourages the player to figure out its multiple secrets. The mini-games add that extra spark to the character's actions, making dull or mundane conversations into interesting and dynamic debates. And then there's free time, where you get to go around and talk to your classmates in a one-on-one setting. Free time is perhaps the most brilliant mechanic in the Danganronpa franchise. You have a huge cast of broad and expendable characters, and you don't have time to flesh out all of them, so what do? Free time. It might seem like a trashy dating sim.
Seduce me.
What? Spy, I ain't gonna
Seduce me!
And that's because it is. It also allows the players to decide who to follow and grow attached to, meaning that you get to decide which deaths will have you crying, which ballots will be filled with regret as you cast them, and which characters will cause freakouts because it's about time for the story to commit a murder and you haven't seen them and oh my gosh, where are they? And all that good stuff. Now for Danganronpa V3. What did I find wrong with it? Well, for my first video game based analysis, I have to say, it has nothing to do with the gameplay. Honestly, V3 is either better or the same when it comes to raw gameplay, cause there isn't much Spike can do wrong in that regard. It's a visual novel with some mini-games thrown in. Just throw in some new, unique, and entertaining mini-games and you're right as rain. No, Danganronpa is still at its heart a visual novel, with a few bells and whistles attached. And visual novels aren't games, they're books for millennials. There are ways you can mess up a book though. And as such, there are ways you can mess up a visual novel, and that's in its writing. If certain elements in a story just don't hit, especially when compared to previous works, it stands out. And it's this game's failures of these written elements that lead me to believe that Danganronpa V3 was disappointing. And if we analyze these elements individually compared to its predecessor, we can understand how and why the game failed. Let's begin our investigation with the mystery aspect of each game. I refuse to believe there is anybody watching this video that doesn't understand why well-written mysteries matter in a murder mystery. A mystery is well written if it's solvable, yet challenging. They lay out boundaries and rules that need to guide the reader, yet encourage outside-the-box thinking. This means elements like the improbable can often impede mystery solving. This isn't to say that all mysteries have to be realistic and follow the rules of real life, but you need to add those extra rules, and they need to be stated beforehand. In the first game, the cases start out pretty realistic, and most of them are generally solvable before the trial even begins. The cases become more and more ridiculous as time progresses in the game. This is reasonable though, as the cases should become harder from a game balancing perspective, and the cases would become more and more wilder as students learn from the past mistakes of other students. So I feel that the best way to make a sequel would be to repeat the pattern. Have the cases start as easy, well, maybe not that easy, and continue to make them more complex over time. Sadly, Danganronpa 2 instead starts with how complex the last case was and keeps going. The wild cases in the game generally reduces a fun and important aspect of the franchise, and hurts Danganronpa 2 overall, leaving what could have been a great strength as probably one of the weakest aspects of that game. And Danganronpa V3 is just as bad, if not worse, when it comes to having two complex cases. The franchise over time has suffered from a complexity creep, where each game's murders have become increasingly difficult and complex. This reduces the chance of the player being able to solve the mystery and greatly dampens the fun the player can have, as well as make the player feel cheated or robbed by the experience. It feels less and less like it's attempting to create a fun and solvable mystery, and instead is attempting to get a reaction out of the player. Next, we should take a look at the settings of each game. When it comes to stories, settings are responsible for so much more than just the physical location of the game. Settings themselves set up the entire tone of the game just through its aesthetics alone. In Danganronpa 1, the game takes place in an abandoned school that's almost completely separated from the outside world. This creates this creepy and paranoia-driven atmosphere. The feeling of isolation helps encourage the murders in the game and brings a sense of urgency to the character's actions. In Danganronpa 2, the player is treated to a deserted resort. While the island has creepy parts about it, it doesn't nearly affect the story in the way that the school did. This isn't to say that it's a bad location, it's just not a dark one. Instead, it focuses more on the mystery aspect of the game, by introducing entire abandoned buildings and sections of the island, and helps enforce the greatest mystery of the game, which is, why is the island abandoned? The island works, but is not nearly as significant as the school is in the first game. Now, the next question is, how's V3's location compared to the first two games? When it comes to V3, I don't have a problem with the location. It's an abandoned jail, and it's just okay. The location's creepiness is countered by the fact that you can go outside and touch grass, but overall it's fine. It doesn't set up a tone like it did in other games. Instead, it's there to fulfill the goal of the main plot, as it almost feels like a Danganronpa parody location. Perhaps more important to the tone of the story than the setting is characters. Side characters have always been popular in Danganronpa. I mean, look at the cosplays. Yeah, there's a lot of Hajimes and some Makotos, but I would bet that Ibuki cosplays far outnumber the other two. The characters are responsible for supporting the story, and their actions are the main driving forces to pull the story forward. You have a large cast with a bunch of personalities, so of course they would become popular. In Danganronpa 1, a lot more of the characters were irritable, standoffish, and generally in bad moods. But this makes sense. They're not badly written characters as much as they're just characters for the setting. Danganronpa 1 takes place completely inside a school, isolated from the outside world. The characters all feel paranoid, stressed, and everything that I had mentioned earlier. And in that situation, I would imagine that conversations would suffer. While the characters were good in Danganronpa 1, the side characters absolutely reached their best point in Danganronpa 2. In Danganronpa 2, the scenario is a lot brighter. As such, characters have more time to be themselves, and we get to explore more positive aspects of their personalities. Maybe brighter would be the wrong word for it, but it's definitely not as stressful as in Game 1. Yeah, the characters are still in a life or death situation, but it's kinda hard to be immensely stressed out when you also want to go enjoy the hot summer's day on the beach. Each character archetype is spread out, and only a few really feel like they overlap. The game handles side characters wonderfully, and the only thing that it suffers on is character development. While there are some characters that develop wonderfully, there are others that desperately need it but never get character development. And then there's Soda.
It is evolving, just backwards.
The strengths of the characters in 2 are its fully fleshed out static characters that are completely realized. As you talk and interact with them, you realize more aspects of their personalities, as they develop into narrower and narrower characters. However, their refusal to change is what ultimately leads to their fate. This makes every character interesting, and the stakes of the characters even more interesting. When it comes to side characters, Danganronpa 2 was very much the best of the franchise. But how does Danganronpa V3 hold up? Sadly, when it comes to side characters, Danganronpa V3 is a mixed case. The bright side is that the characters are a lot more involved in this game than in any other before. Each of the static characters are once again fleshed out into narrower and narrower characters, as you learn more about them and understand the complexity behind their beliefs. The character development this time is also reduced as compared to 2, to a set amount of characters, and this works really well. And the characters that don't survive are normally the ones that refuse to develop. The issue with the V3 cast is actually a perfect example of the problems that I have with the game in general, even if I can't complain about the cast that much. Basically, when characters are introduced, they're normally given 1 or 2 personality traits. This is not so much true as in Danganronpa as it just is within media in general. This allows you to quickly pick out favorites. As I mentioned before, the issue that I have with the characters is the same issue I have with V3 in general. The overall problem I have with them is it takes something that was good with Danganronpa in the past and over-exaggerates it. The 1 or 2 traits that are given to a character to make them interesting are brought to their logical end. This is overall inhuman as it causes them to rely on that one trait way too much for their character. Even when more and more narrower character development is given, they over-rely on that single trait. This makes the characters feel inhuman and thus not as easy to connect to as characters in the past. Not to mention, it's a lot easier to perceive characters as annoying, thanks to this over-reliance on a single trait. Now that we got to learn a bit more about how I feel about the side characters, what about the main character? Well, first, allow me to set what I think about the main character in Danganronpa in general. While I don't think they get a lot of love, I wouldn't say that's because they're poorly written. In fact, in my opinion, one of the best examples of impressive writing and characterization in Danganronpa is the way that they write the main character. Protagonists in video games can be difficult, as they need to be relatable in many ways that main characters in other sorts of medias don't need to be. And while this might seem like an obvious solution to just write a good main character, it can be difficult. You risk writing a character that the audience doesn't like, which will separate them from the game, and makes them feel more like they're being dragged along by the character's decisions. Or you can take a completely alternative route, such as games like Half-Life do. Have a character that's a completely blank slate. It's easy to self-insert into, as they have no thoughts other than what the player is thinking. However, the issue with this is it's hard to do a blank slate character in a story-driven game. Danganronpa actually combines these ideas by making the protagonist the one who is most rooted in reality, yet with enough of a personality you know that it's still a character. Take Makoto and Hajime from Danganronpa 1 and 2. Most of their thoughts are based on reality, and they actually serve as a grounding point to a lot more of their eccentric classmates. However, through their dialogue, you can understand what their personalities are like. In 1, Makoto is more optimistic, and in Danganronpa 2, Hajime is a smart mouth and is normally done with the other characters' crap. The way that they subtly hint at the characterization is what makes it brilliant in my opinion. So what do I think about Shuichi in Danganronpa V3? I know I mentioned earlier that the issue I have with Danganronpa V3 is its exaggeration of traits that made the original games good. However, with Shuichi, it's the opposite. While games in the past did a wonderful job of balancing a character that can be self-inserted into and a character that has a personality, Shuichi just goes too far into the self-insert side, as he ends up being too much of a blank slate. It's not that he's a bad character, but just rather he doesn't have a character. It's a shame. In the earlier chapters, he's a lot more pessimistic and hesitant. It would have been great to add those traits to the blank slate, but I think they didn't in the end because they were afraid that he was going to come off as whiny and annoying, and therefore they just didn't go for it. Overall, the issue that I have with Shuichi compared to the other two is that he is just too bland, and could really have used some kind of personality to back him up. His sins are not as egregious, however, as I feel that the antagonist is in Danganronpa V3. There are several antagonists in Danganronpa, so let's start with the face of the series, Monokuma. But before we can truly understand him, we need to understand his role in the game. And to do that, we need to understand comedy. In traditional comedies, there's a straight man. The role of the straight man is to maintain composure for the audience and feed materials to their comedic partner. Monokuma doesn't play this role. Instead, he's the comedic partner. Monokuma is defined by his eccentric personality, which is famous in comedic partners. So all he really needs is a straight man. Each game handles this differently. In Danganronpa 1, the students act as the straight men, as they're the victims to his schemes and feed him material. In Danganronpa 2, Monomi also helps with the straight man act. While she can be quite eccentric herself, her eccentric behavior lies in between the student's behavior and Monokuma's, allowing her to play both roles depending on the situation. In Danganronpa V3, the Monokubs are introduced. The Monokubs don't add any value to this comedic framework that the other games relied on, and there lies the problems with their introduction. They are all eccentric, if not even more eccentric than Monokuma, leaving the students to again act as the straight man for their conversations. They spend a lot of their time interacting with each other instead of the students, and due to the lack of student interaction with the Monokubs, the conversations they have are wild and nonsensical, since the students aren't maintaining composure or feeding in materials for the conversation. To pull away from the face, we can also look at the twist villain of Danganronpa. For V3, there's Tsumugi, which unlike the original twist villain of Junko, doesn't work. In the original, Junko works because she's dead, or thought to be dead for most of the game, yet it's still hinted that there might be a student who knows more than the others do. Tsumugi doesn't work because of that reason. There's no indication that she might not be who she says she is, making it feel forced and uninspired. There's no hint, not a single slip-up, secret.
One errant twitch!
It's not that I find it unrealistic. Someone can lie their entire life because people do that in real life, ha 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 ha! But it's unrewarding to the player that has no chance to figure it out beforehand, and causes the twist to feel forced and uninspired. You might have noticed that a lot of the complaints I have with Tsumugi in Danganronpa V3 has to do with her involvement in the plot. The plot in Danganronpa V3 is something I feel very conflicted about, and unfortunately it's the final few moments that ruin the entire plot for me. The real plot twist, however, itself is a little generic, but with the exception of Tsumugi's role, it's handled decently. The almost parody-like location, characters, and story all make sense, as they're meant to be in a TV show. Sadly, this doesn't make any of those elements good, and you can't say that a game is good just because its subpar elements are there to explain a plot twist. On top of that, it does one of the worst things that a sequel can do. When making a sequel, it can be challenging, as you have to make new events that don't invalidate the old events in the original, or make it feel like the character's struggles are for nothing. By making Danganronpa 1 and 2 just TV shows, it invalidates these characters' struggles. I've heard that V3 takes place in a different dimension, but there's no way of knowing that without consuming additional media. Any game or form of media should be able to stand on its own, unless it's a direct sequel. And since this was mentioned in none of their earlier sequels, or in the game itself, it's invalid. I want to clarify this again. I have no problem with the game series in general, and I wish that V3 was the best game in the series. I love the Danganronpa series because of its unique style. And in a field of games that are just trying to be major successes but better, its incomparableness makes it stand out even more. It's not that I think it's a bad game, but it learned all the wrong lessons, and I'm calling it out on that. If the series is to continue, it will need to learn from V3's mistakes, and take a positive step in the right direction for the next game. Although with the creator moving on to other projects, it sadly might be the end for this franchise. This doesn't mean, however, the creators can't learn from these issues and solve them in their future games. Up till now, I've been avoiding doing this. If you like the video, I want to keep doing more of these. However, in order to do that, I need more resources to do it quicker and more efficiently, and you can help me do that by subscribing. Thank you so much for watching.